I just realized that I've read 14 books in May, and I'm not sure how. Oh, but a lot of them were quite short, like 300 pages or significantly less. I have several novellas here, so that makes sense. If this guy back here, Mr. Kitty, starts getting overexcited, it's because we're playing Bird TV on our screen, which is just a bunch of little animals that he can think about killing. He's 18 at this point, so he doesn't really do a whole lot of like laying, so this really keeps him entertained. But let's get into the books. I have quite a bit of fantasy, quite a bit of YA, and a foray into the Sarah J. Maas verse to chat about. So kicking it off with The Will of the Many. I finished this at the very beginning of the month, like the very first few days. We are following a young man who is going by the name of Vis. When we first meet him, he is kind of an interesting guy. He's living at an orphanage, even though he's like kind of beyond the age of adoption for most of the kids. But through a turn of events, he is actually sent to a military institution to solve a murder and like uncover secrets. And so he's trying to work his way up through the ranks of this school. The magic of this book is really what makes it kind of stand out for me and makes it really good. I would compare my enjoyment and immersion in this to maybe like Name of the Wind. And I know that's a very like high comparison because I absolutely loved Name of the Wind. This is such a great book. The magic is basically an MLM pyramid scheme. So you have a lot of people on the bottom and they all have to cede their will to the people on the top. Magic and like magical works are achieved using will, so you can do all kinds of stuff with it. There were so many twists and turns and like reveals that I was genuinely shocked by. I thought the pacing was incredibly well done. Like I was just never bored. It was just so good, guys. It was so good. I don't know what else to say. Like, I don't want to talk about the book or the plot itself too much because there's just so many different reveals and so much going on. He's like spying, but he's kind of spying for someone else on the person he's spying for, but is he? I think I will definitely reread this again. We're waiting on the second book. I think it's supposed to come out next year or maybe at the end of this year, but like not soon enough. There was a huge twist at the end that I just didn't see coming. It was kind of like that moment where you're watching Dark and then you're like, wait, what are we doing here? This is not what I thought the book was going to be about. It's not time travel, I don't think. Yeah. My brains. I can't say anything else, but I really loved The Will of the Many. That was one of the best fantasy books that I have read in a really long time. The next three books I'm going to talk about are in my reading blog this month. And the first one is kind of like a moody weird girl lit with a lot of mommy problems and Catholic guilt. That is Fragile Animals. We follow a poet who is working on her second piece of poetry. So she goes to the island of Butte, where there's like very few people that live there. It's really just her at this bed and breakfast. I hope you can't hear the cockatoos screaming outside my house. And she meets a dirty, filthy old man who also is a vampire. This book is really advertised as like, read it for the romance of this vampire and this girl together, and it's not. I feel like that's totally mismarketed. It is not what this book is about. And if you go into it expecting a sexy vampire romance, you're going to be like so disappointed and want to throw it at the wall. This book is really about the character exploring her inner world, her emotional problems and like traumas, talking out loud on these long walks with this vampire guy and talking to herself in her mind. There were aspects of this book that kind of reminded me of an Otesha Moshfegh book like Eileen, but I wouldn't say that it has the same kind of explosive or like shocking ending. It's really just hanging out with this girl in her mind, and she's odd and she's poetic and she's quite funny sometimes in a very dry kind of way. I really enjoyed it. I liked this book a lot. So that is Fragile Animals. The next book that I've read was a gothic coming of age. This is kind of pitched for fans of Shirley Jackson and I Capture the Castle, and I think that's a pretty accurate comparison. It's called Oh Caledonia, And in it we follow Janet. Janet has died at the very beginning of this book, and we're kind of figuring out like who did it, but it's not a mystery. It's a very slow unveiling of Janet's life, her story, from the time that she was very young up to the point that she dies. And I loved it. It's very slow, it's atmospheric, it's got lots of excerpts of poetry because Janet's like a real odd duck. She's really into reading. She struggles with developing relationships with other people sometimes, so she really has a very rich internal world. And I don't know. It's a very short book. It's like 250 pages. And I just thought this was beautiful. Like really one of the best books that I have read ever, or for a really long time. I think if anybody enjoys a gothic atmosphere, you want to read this. It's set in Scotland as well, in a gloomy, drafty old kind of castle. You can go watch my vlog if you want to hear some of my reading of excerpts and just continual raving and love of this book. So the next book I want to talk about, I also read in that vlog. That is the very first book in the Gormenghast series. This is all 3 of the Gormenghast books. The very first one was called Titus, Groan. So I read this also in the vlog, and damn, I'm really just raving about books. We'll get to Sarah J Maas in a minute, don't worry. This is a gothic fantasy. There is really no magic to speak of. Although, like, kind of there is, but there's no, it's not like swinging swords and like mages and elves and stuff. This follows an ecosystem of people who are living in this old, creepy castle that is enormous and sprawling, kind of like Piranesi's house, and they're all kind of trapped. Maybe not explicitly trapped within the castle as in the doors are locked, but they are trapped within the system and structure and rigid hierarchy. Primarily follow a character who I just love called Steerpike, and he is trying to upset that hierarchy. He's trying to climb and get higher up. There's just so many hilarious, amazing characters. I cannot rave about this enough. This is now one of my all-time favorite books. It is probably, as you could tell by just the cover, it's very Edward Gorey vibes. Like if you want Edward Gorey in a castle for like 300 or 400 pages with just the most lush prose and descriptions kind of imaginable. I should have also just mentioned this is an older book series. I think this was published in the 40s-ish, 46, I'm gonna say 46. Gormenghast, absolutely loved this. Really wonderful. I think it's like a forgotten gem. Throne of Glass. I reread the first book. I read it for the first time after I think I read A Court of Thorns and Roses during the pandemic, which I enjoyed A Court of Thorns and Roses, like that series, Agatar, quite a bit. I think it's very fun. And I read Throne of Glass and I just didn't click with it. I think you can tell that Sarah J Maas was younger when she started writing it. If it's her first series, she started when she was 16. So this time I was determined, because I know a lot of people love this series and they're like, oh, it's one of my favorite series of all time. I love this book. And it gets more complex and expands, and it's a different kind of series. It has a very different feel as you progress through. So I thought like, okay, I will read it. I will give it a shot again. I feel pretty much the same on my second reread of the first book. I was fine. I enjoy Celaena's femininity and her also bloodthirstiness. I enjoy and appreciate the way that Sarah J Maas talks about her period and how her body physically has to recover from starvation because, oh wait, I should tell you what this is about. The main character, Celaena Sardothien, is the greatest assassin in Ireland. So she has been caught. We first meet her when she's working in the salt mines. Essentially, they sent her there to work her to death. And she is then called on by the prince and a very sexy bodyguard who have kind of nominated her to be the king's champion. To do this, she needs a series of tasks that she has to compete in, and the winner with other criminals, and then the winner is going to be like the king's champion, the king's assassin, essentially, right? And then the series kind of takes off from there. So yeah, the first book, it was fine. The second book, Crown of Midnight, I buddy read this, which really added to my enjoyment a lot, with Brooklyn. I will link her channel down below so you can hear some of her thoughts. I think she enjoyed it quite a bit, and I did 2. I feel like I can't say anything about it. The world does really expand a lot in this book, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it. I love when you like go into the town and you get to kind of walk through the shops and the streets with the characters and see a little bit more of what this world is like. We get to hear more about what's going on in other parts of the map. The character of the king really comes into question and becomes more of a problem, and Celaena is dealing with a lot more of her own baggage as well in the second book. There is something that happens halfway through the second book that really kind of had me going like, ooh, I don't know if I like this. Yeah, I can't say anything about it, but I think if you've read it, you kind of know probably what I am referring to. Culturally now, we recognize that what happens in that, is not really great. It's a bit problematic, but maybe that wasn't really the case when this book came out or when it was being written. But yeah, literally if I say a single thing about it, you will kind of guess if you're planning to read the series, and it'll be a huge spoiler, so I'm not going to. So I pushed through. I did enjoy it. I enjoyed a lot of the big reveals that were happening, and it really had me intrigued. And then I read Heir of Fire, and this is where I started to get a little bit more hooked. And I have a theory about Sarah J. Maas. The minute that she describes any male character as pure male, their endgame. I think I need to read a little more to know if that's going to be the case, but this is my theory. You can check in with me next month and see if I was right. I think I've really noticed how much better her books were edited in reading these first books. And we got to know some characters. I think I've discovered my new favorite character, Manon Blackbeak. I love a witch with teeth that will eat people. That is great. And I'm really enjoying the journey that Celaena is going on. So I kind of stopped at Heir of Fire. I'm probably going to take a little bit of a break. There is something very extra about Sarah J. Maas's writing style sometimes that I have to be in the right mood for it to enjoy it. And when I'm enjoying it, I do find it very fun. But yeah, I kind of went straight through all 3 of those books really, really quickly. And I'm kind of like hitting a point where I need a little bit more variety now. That was Throne of Glass. I've read up to Heir of Fire. I am going to continue. It's pretty fun. I think I still have a preference for the ACOTAR series in general. That could just be because it was the first one that I read, and I really like Beauty and the Beast kind of retellings. But that's Throne of Glass and my experience of it so far. So the next book that I read was Annihilation. This is not one that ever made it onto any of my TBRs, but it was available at the library, so that's what I picked up. It's kind of a future version of the world where you can have these like AI women that are either like cuddle bunnies or I can't remember the name of any of the other ones, but like they can be a maid, they can be a nurse, they can be a romantic or sexual partner. The way that they are designed is so that they're able to learn from experience, not too unlike a human. Annie, the bot that we're following, is one of these cuddle bunnies. Think of this book as like from the perspective of the Stepford wives, or like one of the wives, as they slowly gain consciousness or an awareness of themselves and other people and the ability to lie and begin to become more human despite being a machine. I thought it was really well executed. Loved it until about 60% as Annie is going about her daily life. Something disrupts it and she begins to have a little bit more awareness of her own desire and her own interest in experiencing and seeing the world and becoming more critical as she's meeting other people. Around the 60% mark, I did find it started to drag a little bit for me. Her owner is really frustrating and infuriating and sometimes a bit gross. He's supposed to be able to see that, but it was just like a point where I'm kind of like, I get it. There are so many real people in the world like this. I don't like spending an enormous amount of time reading about them as well. So I kind of got sick of just sitting around listening to his shit. But I did like the ending. I thought it was pretty satisfying and I read it all in one sitting. It's pretty short. I think it's like 200 something pages and I just sat down one weekend and just ripped through it. Yeah, that's Annihilation. It was fun. It was a good read. I enjoy it and I think I recommend it if it sounds interesting to you. After that, I read Authority. Actually, I listened to it on audio. I read Annihilation a month or two ago, and I really loved Annihilation. Authority, I did not have quite the same experience with. Some of that is because it is a very just different kind of book. Some of what made Annihilation so interesting and exciting for me is that you're getting it from the first person perspective. The character doesn't really have a name, they have a title, the biologist. In Annihilation, the biologist and her research team go on this expedition into a spot called Area X, which is known to be weird, and people who come back, they don't come back the same, they die of like cancers, and it's sort of like a thriller horror, but sciencey. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but it's really good. I'll link to somewhere around my initial review of Annihilation. Authority is from the perspective of the research group that is sending the team into Area X. So we're not going into Area X necessarily this time. We are from one of the main characters. We get a name, we get his background, we get a lot more information about who these researchers are and like how the government is involved, just like the broader happening of things. And I just thought that it was a little too long. Like, I got a lot of extra information I didn't really want necessarily. I was hoping for something that would feel a bit faster paced, and like that last couple of chapters were really good. So I'm not sure yet if I'm going to be continuing the series. I'm going to just kind of let it rest and then see if I'm drawn back to it later. In terms of the narrator, I think it was just fine. I think maybe it would have been better if I had actually physically read the book. I might have preferred hearing the character's inner world in my own mental voice, because there were times when he could be a little bit flat, the narrator. So that's Authority. After that, I read Perfume, a story of a murderer. This is translated, I think, from German. What an absolutely fantastic book, and so unhinged, so unhinged. This is a book that was written in German about a French person set in Paris just before the French Revolution. I probably cannot pronounce any of the names because they're all French, and I'm not going to try. So we follow our main guy. From the moment he is born, he has no scent, like no personal smell to him. And he's also born with a hyper awareness of other scents in the world. And so because he has no scent, he has kind of a rough childhood. Well, he has a rough childhood anyway, because people think like he's demonic or something. So he grows up kind of as an orphan and becomes increasingly fixated on how different things smell and his own lack of ability to smell himself. Because of this exceptional sense of smell, he gets hired as like a journeyman intern for this perfumery that is really struggling. And while he is there, he becomes fixated on creating and distilling the human scent. Given the title, Perfume, the story of a murderer, I think you can kind of see where this might be going. I do suggest that you do not read this while you are necessarily eating. It is very descriptive of everything, and the prose is really beautiful. I think this is one of these books where you appreciate how a really effective description of a sense can create an incredible amount of depth to a story. Like, I just feel like scent is one of those things that is kind of forgotten about unless you're reading a romance and he's like, oh, he smells like pine. And man, we often don't get the level of description that is in this book, and I just loved it. And I thought it was hilarious that this book is set in Paris, the most odorous city in the world. And as I said, it has just an absolutely unhinged, insane ending that I was completely not prepared for. Just wild, and I loved it. So very alchemical vibes, really enjoy it. Perfume. After that, I read What Moves the Dead, and I have been kind of putting this off a little bit because I just didn't feel super drawn to it in the moment. And then I read that it is a retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher, which I love Poe, and obviously the Edward Gorey vibes were very strong this month. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna give it a shot. And it took me a little while to get into it. We are following this main character who is going to their friend's house, the House of Usher, because one of their friends is extremely unwell. While they are there, creepy things start to happen, and secrets, whether it is about the House of Usher itself, or about the people who live in it, or about the townspeople. You're kind of trying to figure it out along with the main character. What I also really enjoyed about this is that it's a former veteran whose mind you're in, and a lot of the other characters are also veterans. One thing I think T. Kingfisher does really well is creating an interesting character and selecting like something unique about them and like really going for it. And she really did that with this veteran. Who they are just really colors your whole experience of reading it. It was really interesting. This is set also in a world like ours. I don't know if it's the original time that House of Usher is also set in, but it's great. If you like a fairly cozy horror, definitely check this one out. I think based on the cover, it's not a spoiler to say that it's very much like the horror of nature and bacteria and fungus, and like it's a little sciencey, and I love a sciencey horror, especially when it leans gothic in this old house. What Moves the Dead? That was a very fun book. I read one nonfiction book called The Age of Magical Overthinking. I love Amanda Montell. I really enjoyed Word Slut. I thought that Cultish was very entertaining and very informative. I did not really have the same experience with The Age of Magical Overthinking. So in this book, Amanda Montell is exploring our cognitive biases. Magical thinking is kind of a term to describe where your internal experience is able to affect external events that are unrelated. About halfway through, I started to skim quite a bit. Part of that is because my education and my work experience is mostly in psychology and research. So I'm kind of familiar with a lot of this already, and it just didn't feel very new to me. I also kind of felt that it wasn't always cohesive. Like there are parts where it's a little bit of a memoir, and she's talking about her own experiences and where these cognitive biases have come into play in her own life, like the sunk cost fallacy, keeping her in a like abusive, not great relationship. I just felt like there was a number of times where she was kind of oversimplifying things. That's probably to make it fun and accessible and interesting for people who aren't wanting to get super sciencey. I think there were some moments in doing that where she attributed things to different cognitive biases that I do not understand to be accurate, or I think are kind of a stretch, maybe is more appropriate way of describing that. I really like her writing style and her voice. I think if you are interested in cognitive biases, this is kind of a fun overview, but I did not personally get much from it, and I didn't love it as much as her other books. So that is The Age of Magical Overthinking. Just go in with a grain of salt, but it's still a fun book. Finally, I got to The Prisoner's Throne. I finished this last night, so my thoughts are very fresh. I wish this was dual POV. That is the first thing I have to say. So this is kind of a spin-off duology from the original Folk of the Air series, which I love, by Holly Black. We're following Fae, but it's Holly Black's version of Fae, which I just adore, because they are sort of twisted creatures of sticks and stones, and they are very interested in breaking your bones. You can't really read it, I think, without reading the first book, because so much of these books are based on the events and following the events of the initial trilogy, that I wouldn't really recommend it. I think you would lose a lot of the experience. Because we're following up so much on all of these other books and stories and stuff, I'm not really going to give a big recap of all of Prisoner's Throne. We're coming from Oak's perspective this time. The first book, if you will remember, is from Ren's perspective. I really liked Ren. I thought she was a great character. I liked how vicious she was. I love her desperation, and her power was really interesting. And she was just in so many difficult situations in this book. I would have loved a dual POV. I feel like she had some really interesting and important character growth that I would have loved to have seen from the inside of her head and her experience. Oak also had important character growth, and I understand why it was important for us to at least have some of his POV, but I was a little disappointed with that, but I still liked it. Holly Black just does this angst and torment and like tricking each other so well, and the aesthetic and the feel of the stories and the way that she creates these characters, I will always love it. I'm always going to love her books. She's really one of my favorite authors, but this was just not my favorite one by her. After that, my last book that I have completed is Vile Bodies. This is by Evelyn Wow. This is a hilarious book. This is very British humor. It's very 1920s. It is a satirical novel following the bright young things after World War I. So basically all of the fairly wealthy partiers that are kind of reveling in debauchery and all of this stuff. And it really is hilarious. Actually, I came to this book because I was trying to find something that would give me a similar feeling to Fleabag. I rewatched Fleabag this month as well, and I just loved it, and I kind of had a bit of a like TV hangover. Vile Bodies came up as like one of these stories that might have a similar humor to them. So I picked this up and I really enjoyed it. It's like 300 pages. It's very dialogue heavy as well. I think it would translate really well to a radio play or maybe an audiobook. The way that the characters talk is just, it's so charactery. it's funny, and their words tell you so much about their privilege, their innocence, their lack of innocence, their ambitions, and the way that they bounce off of each other. It's such a delight. So I think if you're looking for something that's like very 1920s, Aristocat, jazz age, Vile Bodies, definitely recommend. Very interested to check out some more of Evelyn Waugh's books because that was my first one from him. I'm gonna just keep going, even though I can tell that we live close to a field. I think I've said this before. In this field, there is a professional sports team which plays. So I have a bunch of like 20-year-old boys jumping around and hooting and being buffoons out there. So you'll probably hear them in the background, and hopefully I can edit them out a little bit and you'll hear me more. Because I want to just talk really quickly about Angela Carter's collection or book of fairy tales. I have started reading this. I am not finished yet. I'm not at all finished yet. I've read like four of them. I've read four stories and the introduction. So the introduction is by Angela Carter, and then these are fairy tales which she has collected. It was originally called the Virago Book of Fairy Tales, I think. But what makes them kind of fun and interesting so far is that she has selected fairy tales that center women and women's experiences, and I'm really enjoying them. They're from all over the world. So there's some from the Inuit. Actually, there's several from the Inuit here. There's some from different parts of Africa and English, Irish, all of that. I'm really excited and enjoying it quite a bit. I don't have any favorites yet, but I'll probably still be reading it next month, and I will share some favorites with you then. I'm just keeping this by my bed and reading like one or two before I go to sleep. So the part names are Brave, Bold, and Willful, Clever Woman, Resourceful Girls, and Desperate Stratagems, The Sillies, Witches, Good Girls and Where It Gets Them. That's so ominous. Unhappy Families, Moral Tales. I appreciate for Angela Carter that Moral Tales is like one of the shorter ones. Strong Minds and Low Cunning. Up to Something, Black Arts and Dirty Tricks. Beautiful People, Mothers and Daughters, Married Women, and Useful Stories. So very curious how this is gonna go. Really enjoying it so far, obviously. It's just a collection of fairy tales and a lot of stories that I haven't really heard before. So that is the book I'm currently working on, and I will update you next month. So if you have made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear your thoughts on any of the books that I've talked about. If you've read them, if you haven't, I'd like to know if you're planning to read them. And if you have any suggestions for more Evelyn Waugh, like I know that he has written quite a backlist and I'm not sure which ones to pick up next. So if you have thoughts, let me know. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching and spending some time with me here. Thank you for ignoring these goofy boys, and I will see you sometime soon in my next video. Bye!